This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook, Chapter 24, Cigarette Roulette. Mom was a smoker my whole life. She's smoking in every photo I've ever viewed, whether sailing a boat, driving a car, or just lounging on a patio next to a pool. A cigarette was always close at hand. Our family could have easily been the national laboratory for the effects of secondhand smoke on young children. Such was the constant cloud above us. This was America in the 1960s, and we were a country of smokers. We had the Marlboro Man. He galloped right into our living rooms. My dad smoked. Uncle Carrie smoked. Most of my buddies' parents smoked. My three aunts, smokers all, Mary, Fanny, and Jean, would often visit in the winter months, and it was New York City's Monkey Bar on a Friday night. Our house was filled with smoke, and no matter where one went, little white strings of it would assault, irritating the nose and stinging the eyes. Riding in a car was the worst. One could either choke on smoke or melt from the blast of heat and humidity that blew in from outside. Dad had quit. For some undisclosed reason, one day he just gave it up, which is no easy task for sure. After all, he had acquired the habit during the war, along with an affinity for Scotch. Is it possible that any soldier in World War II did not smoke and drink Scotch? He stayed with a smokeless plan for quite a while. I remember the one time he relapsed. It was precipitated by the stress of keeping track of 14 pieces of luggage as the family, including 78-year-old Grandma and her two sisters, roved around Europe from train to bus to train again at the back end of a regatta in Carantec, France. Back at home, he gave it up for good. Mom was a different story. She wore the ugly habit like some kind of badge of courage. Many times over the years, we prodded her to quit. Her response was consistent. She would remind us that our grandfather, Archibald, not only chain-smoked cigars, but complimented them with copious amounts of fine Scotch on a daily basis. He lived to the ripe old age of 82. She had us there and played that card repeatedly over the years when any of us harassed her. The drill dragged on. Any time my brothers or I had the opportunity to push her to quit, we did. She would in turn play the Archibald card. Our attempts were a tedious and, in the end, fruitless endeavor. It was a weeknight, and I was at home fiddling around. I had completed my homework in a typically haphazard fashion hours earlier. Sitting on a tall stool at the long kitchen counter, I observed Mom and Dad at their respective nightly positions. Across from me, at the mahogany bar Dad had painstakingly designed and built by hand. It was a masterpiece of fine craftsmanship. They were chatting and passing the time after another taxing day, attempting to keep track of their rambunctious brood. Refreshed scotches were at hand, and my mother had a smoldering cigarette in her ashtray. I suddenly had an inventive idea and went immediately into action. Sliding off the counter stool, I trotted around through the kitchen and hopped up between Mom and Dad. Unlike all other bars in South Florida in the 1960s, this one had no age limit. As we sat there, she with a book and me with a plan, we chatted idly about nothing. An open pack of Lark cigarettes sat nearby, her brand of choice at the time, and my goal was to pilfer just one. Ever so slowly, a millimeter at a time, I slid the pack closer and closer whenever she returned to her book or made a comment to my dad. It was important that I work only when she was distracted. She was always wary of any illicit activity her boys might be up to. More than once, she had caught Lobster or me in the act of pilferage as we attempted to slip off with a couple of larks so we could sneak out into the woods and have a puff. Ever so slowly, the pack of cigarettes inched along the superbly polished mahogany surface. Suddenly, Chesterfield, one of her Yorkies, rounded the corner, and jumped onto her lap. The timing was perfect. I made my move. At that precise moment, I swept up the cigarettes and shook one loose, dropping the pack right where it had resided just moments before. As she cuddled and coddled the dog, I cupped the cigarette in the palm of my hand. Dad continued to sketch on his yellow legal pad, oblivious to my sleight of hand. Hopping down off the bar stool, I sprinted into my bedroom. I flicked on the light, pulled open my dresser drawer, and rummaged around for the tools I needed to perform cigarette surgery. The modern cigarette has been in production for many, many years. It is a manufacturing process of great precision. If one considers how the shredded tobacco must be stuffed tightly into a tin sleeve of paper and then jammed tightly into a cardboard box without damage, one has to be impressed. I had pilfered a single cigarette and would get just one attempt. I had to make this work. With my desk lamp illuminating the way, I held the cigarette securely near the top and started to prick at the end of it with a pair of tweezers. I had to carefully rough up the tobacco first so I could pull it out shred by shred. It was a painstaking process. In 5 minutes, I had removed about half of it. Time to reload. As important as removing the tobacco was not damaging the hollow paper tube that held it. Prick a single, small hole in a cigarette, and it cannot be smoked. Next, I pulled from my drawer a small bag of flash powder. There are certainly many explosive chemical powders. The most common is black powder, found in the typical shotgun shell. It burns slowly, relatively speaking, though fast enough to hurl a projectile or group of them at a moving target with enough force to impede its progress. Flash powder is a much finer substance. With the look and feel of silver talcum powder, it's used for all kinds of fireworks, including firecrackers and cherry bombs. It burns with much higher velocity and, when packaged correctly, is extremely powerful. This made it the powder of choice whenever I was in need of an explosion. The challenge before me was a difficult one. What was the correct amount of powder to accomplish the job at hand? Too little, and the message would not be delivered with the appropriate impact. Too much, and I might ignite her hair. I opted for the less is more approach and dropped just a couple of pinches of powder into the open cigarette. I then carefully replaced the shredded tobacco with the tweezers, packing it with a wooden matchstick now and then along the way. When complete, it looked fairly good. Though there were a few crinkles in the otherwise smooth paper tube, it was hard to tell that this cigarette had been altered. Knowing Mom, it was highly unlikely that it would be examined at all before she lit it up. I skipped back to the kitchen and hopped up next to her, palming the trick cigarette in my left hand. She was rambling on with Dad about the house's cockroach problem and barely noticed I was back. This would be easy. I quickly grabbed her pack of larks and spilled it on the bar. She reprimanded me for dumping her cigarettes and flicked my earlobes a couple of times. I apologized profusely and assured her that I would be more than happy to pick up the mess. I reloaded the package one by one, making certain that the last one to be slipped inside was indeed the one I had meticulously modified. She reminded me not to break any. I left my special cigarette protruding, begging to be the next in line. Hopping down, I trotted around through the kitchen and jumped back up on the stool at the end of the countertop, a premier perch to enjoy the explosive spectacle to come. As I watched and waited, bare feet swinging back and forth, I began to consider the possible scenarios. Would the cigarette hiss and spark, burst into flames, or explode with a bang? I was counting on something in between. A small pop and puff of smoke was my hope, but there was no assurance. She snuffed out her fading cigarette and reached for the fresh one. She placed mine between her lips and, as she talked out of the side of her mouth to Dad, lit it up. Now I wondered some more. I admit to feeling a few pangs of panic and remorse creeping in. When would the flash powder flash? Would it be as her cigarette rested harmlessly in the ashtray between puffs, held between her fingers, or in the middle of a deep inhale? Maybe it wouldn't go off at all, but I doubted that. Dead center in the middle of a deep inhale, the powder began its chemical reaction and ignited in a blinding burst of light. The explosion was not loud, but it was large, much more than I had anticipated. Mom's face and head were obscured by the flash and a large puff of white smoke. She emitted a loud gasp, a cough, and a scream. Dad almost fell off his bar stool, but grabbed the rail at the last second, steadied himself, and recovered. He leapt to her aid. The commotion continued for a few moments, with her gasping and coughing and Dad scurrying around her, trying to figure out what was going on. Soon they concluded that nothing really serious had occurred, only that her cigarette had exploded. The doctored lark was obliterated, as was any evidence. I would find tiny shards of its remains under the dark bar weeks later. The good news? Mom was not seriously injured. Her eyebrows and bangs were crinkled and singed. I could smell the familiar and distinct odor of burning hair. Dad, always a fixture of problems and broken things, quickly retrieved a damp cloth from the guest bathroom off the family room and helped wipe down her face. Mom was at once in a bit of shock and also fairly pissed off. The bad news? They then looked straight across the kitchen at me, knowing in a nanosecond, without a tiny shred of doubt, that I had nearly blown my mother's face clean off. They raged at me for a few minutes and chuckled a bit too. I didn't even begin to try to deny what I had clearly done. The mountain of circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. My guilt, a fait accompli. It got worse. Dad marched me into my bedroom before long and confiscated my small bag of flash powder. However, the evening ended on a positive note. Mom freshened up, came downstairs in her robe, flicked the back of my earlobes a couple of more times, and that was that. The assault had really rattled her, so Dad fixed her a stiff drink, and she had a therapeutic smoke as they resumed their positions at the mahogany bar. The operation complete, but completely ineffective, I wandered off later to my bedroom and retrieved another small bag of flash powder from inside a shoe deep in my closet. I placed it all the way at the back of my underwear drawer. The stuff was so powerful, unstable, and flammable that for safety, I always broke it down into small batches. It was hidden all over my room. Dinkle and I discovered 7-Eleven and beer. Lobster consumed number 6 of his 9 lives. It's coming up next. It's chapter 25, and it's called 7-Eleven Beer Dash.